So, welcome to the Adventures in Learning podcast. When the advanced reader copy for Little Monsters hit my hands, I tore through this book in less than a day, and I knew immediately I wanted this author on the show. There is something absolutely magical in the reimagining of this world, but even more, there is this beautiful storytelling vibe that goes through where this book will stand next to Little Women with no problem whatsoever, but it'll entice kids who are modern to want to take a look at it. I'm so excited to welcome Máire Roche to the show today. We are going to be talking Little Monsters and Little Women. We're going to be talking Bromantasy, her latest book that's coming out. And we're going to just talk about the need for beautiful storytelling. Wonder, curiosity, connection. Where will your adventures take you? I'm Dr. Diane, and thank you for joining me on today's episode of Adventures in Learning. Máire, welcome to the show.
Hi, Diane. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat about Little Women. It's one of my favorite topics.
Well, I am so glad you're here. And, when I fell in love with this book, I had asked your publicist, could I have some advanced copies to share with the cast of Little Women at Riverside Center for the Performing Arts? Because I had this thought that it would be really fun to have actresses who are totally caught up in portraying Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy to look at their counterparts in your book. And so the girls read the story, and we had our own little book club, which is airing this week. And it was absolutely delightful because they fell in love with the representation of your characters, particularly Meg, who said, Meg never gets, she's just Meg. And suddenly this makes so much sense. But they loved the fact that the characters were plausible. They loved the monstrous powers you gave them. Mm-hmm. And they loved the fact that there was a modern day worry about finances and the foster care system wrapped up in this story. So it was a major hit with them. And what I wanted to open with asking you is, tell us what inspired this rendition of it. Tell us a little bit about Little Monsters.
Yeah, so this idea came to me kind of out of the blue. I've always loved Little Women. I grew up on Little Women. And I always really resonated with Meg, from eldest daughter to eldest daughter. This book is an eldest daughter book. If you know, you know. If you grew up with a lot of younger siblings looking to you, if you have that experience in any form, I think this book will resonate with you because it's Meg's story. And so I knew I loved that story. I knew I wanted to write something for middle grade that was kind of spooky, that was about anxious girls finding their way back to themselves. It was about, and I thought of Little Women, and I thought of the structure of the four sisters. And I thought, how can modern readers connect with them? So as a former teacher, especially, I think a lot about how to engage children with literacy and reading. And middle grade is often the place where we lose kids. So we get kids who are avid readers of chapter books and early reading through late elementary school. And then there's this drop-off point. And we see this with girls and especially with boys. The reading levels of a lot of young adults is so far from where middle grade is at. And so I wanted to write something that was like really recognizable and short and kind of an aspirational read for younger readers to close that gap. And I was also recently unemployed. My position had been eliminated at my job. And I was like, you know what? What if I tried writing full time? Let's see what I can do. Let's see how fast I can write a book. And I had this idea just kind of like at the back of my head for so long. And I sat down and I wrote it in 4 days.
Wow.
So when you said you flew through your read, I was like, well, I flew through the write. So that's perfect.
That's amazing.
Yes, it came together like I wrote 10 to 15,000 words every day, which is much, much higher than my usual pace. I wish I could sustain something like that, but I cannot. But for Little Monsters, it was just so easy. Like I had this, I feel like I had been in conversation with these characters for so many years, since I was 11 or 12 when I first read that book. And I felt like I just knew them, and I knew exactly who they would be in this modern setting. And I knew who Meg would be with the financial pressure of trying to get Halloween costumes for her younger siblings, because we see who she is when she tries to make Christmas happen. I thought it was especially fun to have the opening passages reflect each other that way, but have like really set the modern tone of where we were. So yeah, that's kind of a convoluted answer to that question, but I feel like I've both been with these characters for so long, and also this new rendition of them came so naturally.
Well, I love that. And you talked about the opening passage. I'm thinking maybe it would help people to just hear you read a little bit from Little Monsters. And then we'll move into talking a little more deeply about the characters and all those wonderful things you just brought up.
I would love to. I can start with a little piece of chapter 1. How does that
Sounds
sound?
good.
Halloween won't be Halloween without any costumes, Jo grumbled, kicking off her tattered boots as she entered Meg's bedroom, then flopped on the floor next to Meg's bed. Meg sighed and looked down at her little sister and then at her own sweatshirt. The seams were unraveling near the wrists on both sleeves because Meg always picked at them when she was nervous. And in her life, that tended to happen a lot. It's not fair! Amy, the youngest of the March sisters, walked in behind Jo, trailing her feet dramatically. All the other kids are dressing up as something new and cool. Yeah, it sucks, Meg said impatiently, but it's not like we have anybody who can buy us a costume. Besides, I wasn't going this year anyway. I'm a little too old. She was about to turn 14, and though some of her friends were definitely still going, Meg was different. For one thing, she lived in foster care with her younger sisters, so she had some grown-up worries overall. For another, she was, well, maybe a monster.
I love it.
That's my story.
And I love the fact that you sort of opened with that very iconic "Christmas won't be Christmas without presents" line. Anybody who's read Little Women knows that, and that's just such a beautiful, immediate call out.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about with middle grade trying also to get boy audiences to read. And, I can see boys being scared off by Little Women,
Mm-hmm.
but in Little Monsters, you've made the male characters from Little Women also make appearances, and they're very strong, whether it's Laurie, who's got his own secrets and his own things that he's hiding, or John Brooke, who suddenly goes from being kind of a cipher in Little Women, we don't get to know much about him, to he's front and center, and he's a really interesting character and a foil to Beth or to Meg in this one. I think there's something for everybody in here. What was it like to take established characters and think about how do I give them new quirks, new shades, make them wrapped up for a modern audience?
Yeah, I think so much of Meg's character, especially, like, she doesn't really ever consider how she feels in the original narrative. She has such a character driven by duty. And often the only times her feelings are really contended with are when her feelings involve like girly pursuits that she wants to have. Like, she wants the fancy dresses. She wants a life that is a little bit, she wants to be in more upscale society. Like, she wants to have that. And I think she wants the safety and security of it, but she also loves pretty dresses. And those are the only times we really get Meg's feelings on page. And so I wanted to let the eldest daughter feel her feelings and not be shamed for it. And I love the original. Like, this is never in, critique of the original.
No, of
But
course not.
Yeah, but I missed, like, I wanted Meg to have the advantages of the freedom she would have in modern society. I wanted to think about that. I was like, here, she doesn't have to just remain in service of her family and just follow this duty. She gets married, she marries out of love, but she also has this like duty to her family that she tries to fulfill for the entire length of time that we know Meg throughout the book. All of the books, honestly. And so I wanted to translate that to, like, how does that make her feel, though? Like, what is going on inside of Meg as she tries to carry this family? And Jo is also trying to carry this family, and they both have these very different ideas of how to do that. And you see that through Jo's perspective in the original narrative. And she and Meg are often on the same team, but also often at odds about how they do it. And they can't really understand each other because Jo is like, what do you want with all of the like fancy dresses? What do you want with all of the marriage and all of the love and romance? And Meg is like, why do you want to cut your hair so short and write books? Like, how does that help? And both of them are like so very different that they work so well together, and they work so hard to bridge gaps between them. But I really wanted to write about that when you're like 14 and 12 and you don't know what you're doing yet. And so I wanted to take that and just like transpose it in this modern space, but also on characters who are children, because I think we often read Little Women as those girls are grown up when they start the story, even though they're very much not, but they often read a little bit adult, I think, for modern readers. So I thought it was kind of fun to take those like big worries they have and these big kind of opposing experiences they have of the world and how they respond to the really like limited ability for women to express themselves at the time and all of that, and transpose it into a modern family where they're trying to keep some secrets and keep themselves together.
And how did you decide which monstrous quality each little woman was going to get?
Oh, I actually had so much fun with that because I thought I wanted to match it to a version that made sense for each character and who they are in that original text. So before I sat down to write, I thought, Meg needs to have something to do with like physical appearance that she can't mask. So she cares a lot about her physical appearance. She likes to look pretty. She likes to, and she cares a lot and knows a lot how people see her and you know, how that impacts all of their lives. She's the eldest daughter. And so she has this like worry about the impression she gives affecting everyone else. So she has to dress nice. She has to know how to curl her hair. She has to know these things in the original text. So I thought I actually thought, what would be the most inconvenient for each of their lives? And then jumping to Amy. Amy wants to be an influencer because of course Amy does. This is Amy.
Right.
So Amy March, the most inconvenient thing for her is that she's going to turn into a big, smelly, fishy mermaid if she gets too close to salt water. And so she has this like thing that kind of conflicts with her desire to have this like cool, suave image. And then for Jo, I think that hers and becoming kind of essentially a shapeshifter or werewolf-esque creature felt very like, oh, Jo has such a different relationship with her own physical appearance that she would not be that bothered if she had teeth or nails like Meg does. She'd be like, well, I guess the other kids are going to see me with long nails now and just carry on with her business. But because she like fully transforms, it still gets in her way and it kind of nags her because she's like, well, I don't care that much about my physical appearance, but I really have to because it's so distinct and so different. And I also was writing Jo as essentially a kid in very early stages of experiencing transition and being queer and trans and like that kind of complicated identity. And so her transforming her physical body obviously reflects that. And then for Beth, I was like, Beth is kind of this character that feels not as like weighted to the narrative. Like we always sort of know that Beth isn't going to be there for the whole story. Like they give us that with Beth early on. And so Beth having literal wings and flying away at the earliest opportunity if people aren't there to like tether her to earth, I felt kind of reflected that original story. So I had the reasons and thoughts behind all of them, but it was really fun to go back and forth. And I loved how they portrayed them on the cover. They had originally given Amy these little horns just in the mock-up, and I thought those were so cute, even though no one has like little devilish horns in this story. But I thought the way that they portrayed all of the girls in the cover, and you can see if you look closely that Meg has this like little sharp tooth in the silhouette of her face against the moonlight, and it's really fun. Yeah.
It really is. No, and I love all of that. And I have to say, one of the things that the actress playing Beth said is she's like, thank you for not killing me. And that's not a spoiler, folks. They're 14. So this is long before Beth would be killed in the Little Women thing. But each of the actresses were like, the actress who played Meg was so happy that this story was centered around her character. And the other three were like, well, when's my turn? So are there plans to do a Little Monsters sequel for each of the sisters?
I would love to write a Little Monsters book for each of the girls. I have something outlined for each of them, and that will depend on a lot of different publisher and kind of behind the scenes things. But I have different theme cities for each of the girls. I would love to write. I had like a spring break trip for Jo planned and a summer internship kind of deal for Amy and a different theme cities, which are mentioned in the book as these like little extra magical spaces where monsters live and where unexplained magic kind of just happens. And Salem is one of them. That's where the book is set. But I would love to write about different theme cities that are mentioned. Brooks mentions a theme city his mom is from. So I would love to explore that world a little bit more and give each of the girls their story.
I love that, and I found myself, we had gone to Concord, Massachusetts after I read this book, and my daughter was doing research for playing Beth. And as we're looking around, I did find myself looking for signs of magic in Concord.
Did you find any?
We won't tell the audience, but of course I did. In a place where you have Thoreau and Emerson and Louisa May Alcott, of course you do.
Yeah.
And if you haven't been, I will encourage you to take a walk in the graveyard in Concord because all of them are buried on sort of the same hill. There's a writer's hill where they all are. It could be inspirational.
I'm sure it would be. I think that before I write Jo's book, I should probably go and spend some time there.
I think so. And they actually have a thing at Orchard House where you can sit in Louisa May Alcott's room and write at her desk for like an hour. They do this for writers. So just a shout out from my little tour.
Yeah, thank you. That's a tax write-off for me, and also a lot of fun for 8-year-old Mary, who's gonna get to read my
Exactly.
mind. Yes.
Hi, friends. This is Patrick Ahern, CEO and Producing Artistic Director for the Riverside Center for the Performing Arts. On stage, March 18th, Riverside presents Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, the Musical. Little Women follows the lives of the 4 March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, as Jo details their experiences growing up in the 1860s America. Filled with laughter and tears, love and loss, Little Women will lift your spirits. Voted Best Theater by Broadway World, USA Today, and Fredericksburg.com, Riverside brings Broadway's best right to your backyard. Purchase tickets at riversidedt.com or call 540-370-4300. Riverside Center for the Performing Arts is a 501c3 nonprofit organization.
So you said you were Meg when you were little. Did you act out the books? Like how did you engage with the Little Women when you were a kid?
Oh, I loved Little Women so much. I grew up in kind of a pretty restrictive environment. My parents were very, very religious, and there was like limited books that we could actually read and were allowed to. And a lot of them were older classic books because they had a lot of suspicions towards newer modern stories. So I read Little Women at a really young age. I think I read an abbreviated version when I was about 7 or 8. And then I read the full book when I was 10 or 11. And I loved Meg best. I always have. I loved the way Meg challenged norms in more subtle ways than Jo did. I thought that there was power in that she kind of had this sort of under the surface strength and courage. And I think that, and obviously we get Jo's perspective throughout Little Women, so we don't always know what Meg is thinking because Jo doesn't know what Meg is thinking, which I think is well done in the original story. But I think that I resonated a lot with her as the eldest daughter in a big family and trying to do the things you need to for your family and keep your family together and keep your family afloat, but also to find a version of things for yourself that feels happy and safe. And I think that Meg does that when she marries John Brooke. She chooses this path that she maybe wouldn't have thought she would at a younger age, but she chooses the path that makes her feel the most free and the most loved. And I wanted that for me as a kid, and I wanted to give that to Meg in a new setting with Little Monsters.
I love that. I was talking to my sister this weekend, and it was the two of us, and I still remember acting out the stories in the garage and, taking boxes and things and turning them in. And I was always a weird hybrid of Jo and Beth, which is an interesting connection in the book as well. And I think that they're almost two sides of the same person in some ways, that, there's that desire to be free and to challenge norms and to be creative. But at the same time, Beth is sort of the yin and the yang. She's the balance and the strength and the need for family. And then I always made my sister be Amy.
Yes. Yeah, I used to make my cousins act out plays, some of them Little Women related, but I was always like stage directing some kind of story as a kid and writing profusely everywhere I could, anytime that I could.
Well, and I think that's the hallmark of a writer, maybe, is that ability to imagine and project and sort of stage direct characters and get other people or other characters to do what you want them to do.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think it was just something that was so like, people have asked me when I decided to be a writer, and I can't tell them a real answer because I just always have been writing. I can't remember a time when I was not spinning some kind of story. I have lots of deadlines now as a full-time writer, but even before that, I just was always writing. So it feels a little like it doesn't feel all that different to me to constantly be on deadline because I was always working on something since I can remember being able to hold a pencil.
Well, and that was something I could sense and was going to ask is, in terms of your adventures in learning, you said that you're now writing full time.
Yeah.
What sort of led that path to get there? Because I know kids are always interested in the question, how did you become who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that traditional publishing is a really hard thing to do full time as a career. So I want to say that first is it's not a really simple path. I had to work full time and balance that plus writing books for many years. And it is still something that is complex because payment schedules within publishing can be really unpredictable. Most people I know who do writing full-time have a partner with a very steady full-time job that has benefits. I don't have that safety net. My wife is in school, and we are just kind of doing our best together. But the way that I got there was years ago. After I'd finished college, I was like, I have time to really dedicate to writing again. I have a goal of publishing a book. So I spent $8, $8.99 for a notebook. And I was like, this will be my first investment in my publishing career. I'm going to do this. And it had those like little dates at the top. And so every time I hit like some kind of new milestone, I would like circle the dates and I would say what had happened. And then I used it to just like take notes, character notes on a project, sometimes handwrite if I needed to. And I did that. And then I was accepted in 2 pitch wars. And now it's a now defunct mentorship contest that paired established writers with newer writers. So I got some visibility that way. And I found an agent. And then things actually stalled out for a little while. So I was still working full time as a teacher through the pandemic. A couple different agents at that same agency came and went and left the industry. And then I switched to my current agent, and she started just selling books left and right. And so then at that point, I had a few kind of difficult years where I wasn't yet established enough where I could really go full time into writing. So I was operating on a full time deadline schedule, but also working full time. And so there was a lot of just like balancing and juggling a lot of things. But now I'm in a place where my day to day is that when I get up, I come into my office, I light a candle, I talk to my characters. I have a practice where I light a candle and I call on other artists or writers who have inspired me. I'm writing a book right now that's very steeped in Irish folklore. And so I call on Sinead O'Connor and a few other people when I start that. But when I wrote Little Monsters, I lit a candle for Louisa May Alcott and other folks like that. And then, so now that's my day to day. And that first notebook that I bought, I kept buying notebooks in that series, and I'm working out of this one today. So this was like my first investment in my craft was these, and I buy them, and they're actually discontinued now. This is the last one I was able to get. But it feels kind of like a really cool end to this chapter that started with just this like one decision to invest in myself. So if I could leave, especially young readers who maybe want to follow this career, one piece, it's invest in yourself. Like, believe that much. I have all of those old notebooks on a shelf behind me. I have about 5 or 6 of them full now, and I have this one about maybe a fourth of the way full. And it always means something to me every time I pick up that notebook. Like this version of me who was in her early 20s and didn't know where she was going and didn't know if it was possible and knew the odds were so, so low. Many people want to write a book, but being able to get in the door is difficult. And so I am grateful to that version of me who believed and took that first step. So.
Well, and you've written across so many genres. You've got YA, you've got stuff that's mystery, like all kinds of different things. This week, and I loved the pitch for this one, you've got a book out called Bromantasy. And the idea was if David Rose from Schitt's Creek were dropped into The Princess Bride. I'm like, that is a brilliant pitch. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and what went through your head while writing it and what you hope audiences will get?
Oh, it was such a funny book to write. It's very silly. It's very comedic. It's about 2 best friends, Juniper and Mo, who live on their little farm together. And Juniper is desperately in love with Mo, but they don't talk about their feelings. And every winter, Mo gets a little bit restless, and Mo gets like kind of an itch to go and explore. And Juniper's a homebody, and he's like, this man is going to leave me, so I can't tell him I love him. And then also after harvest time, when Mo gets his like little bit of wandering bug, Juniper is like, well, let's go to the tavern and get drunk together. And if we just party all winter long, you won't want to go anywhere else. And then in the midst of this kind of drunken revelry, they accidentally sign up for a quest that they're unqualified for to go and catch a dragon. And Juniper is horrified because he has to leave behind his skincare and his favorite cheeses and also his cat named Mumford. And so he is really unprepared, unqualified, and very resistant. And Mo is like, well, I think we can handle it. And that makes Juniper more anxious. And so I write a lot of anxious characters. That's a theme. But Juniper and Mo go off on this quest. And over the course of this quest, they realize that this dragon might not be as fearsome as they thought. It might actually just be a shape-shifting little girl. Also a theme, apparently, across my work. And there might be a villainous but cunningly handsome prince involved. And lots of feelings and lots of cheese and mead throughout. So it was very fun and very silly. And I got the idea actually, because I was on deadline. My wife and I were at a brewery where I had written until their closing time, because those are some of their great places that are open late that you can go and write if you just have to leave your house. And then we got stuck in the parking lot because there was a fire at a compost center just down the road, and the fire department had run a hose in front of the parking lot. So it's like 1 a.m. I'm sleep-addled and trapped because of a compost fire. And I was like, honey, I think I just want to write a romantasy, but not one of those like high stakes ones. I want to like someone, it's for bros who are dumb. Bro romantasy. And then like that's where it came to me. And then the pitch of like David Rose in Princess Bride was like my original pitch to my agent a year and a half ago. And I love that it has remained kind of the hook of marketing. We immediately had interest, and then it immediately went to auction because that idea just landed with people so well. And I feel really lucky that this book has resonated with people the way that it has. And now I had grabbed an ARC of my UK copy, but it says 2 heroes, 1 brain cell on the front for the ARC, and it is accurate to what that book is.
It seems like it's going to be a lot of fun. And, you talked about you've got some universal themes at work in your work. Why anxiety? Why is that something that sort of manifests itself in your characters?
That's a good question. I think that anxiety is a piece of a lot of my characters also work through PTSD. So I think anxiety is a piece of that. And I think that at some level, Meg is going to eventually, the trajectory of her life is that Meg probably as an adult will, if she goes to therapy, would get a PTSD diagnosis. But she doesn't get that as a kid because children often aren't given those diagnoses, even if they've experienced trauma. Most children who are in the foster care system at all have experienced trauma. I read a lot about foster care and alternative care for children and how that feels and what that experience is like. And so I think anxiety is a more accessible piece of that I can call out to characters in characters. So I'm not going to write the words PTSD into a book written for 10-year-olds because that can be kind of intimidating. I think that I want to caveat that I think that the books that are about mental health that explicitly label them are also really powerful and have a special place. But there are children who are not ready for any of those labels who can still read Little Monsters and can read this physical description of anxiety and be like, oh, I feel that way too. I sometimes feel this. And the books that can like give you words for what you feel inside are so powerful. And especially if you are a kid like Meg, and Meg is lucky. She finds Marmee who does want to love her and guide her, but there are kids who don't have anyone to give them that guidance. And so to have a book that says, hey, like actually other people feel this way, you're not alone, and here's a word for it. And you don't have to be ready for the rest of it, but there is a word for how you feel. And anxiety can be that first step that unlocks more understanding of yourself. And so if you're a kid with PTSD, but the first thing you know about yourself is you have anxiety, that's your first step. You don't just have anxiety, you have PTSD. But anxiety is your gateway to understanding yourself and getting help for that. So I think I write about anxiety, especially for kids, as a way to help them unlock pieces of themselves that I think remained kind of ambiguous or hard to understand.
Well, and that sounds sort of like the seam or that magical spot.
Mm-hmm.
I talk a lot about Dr. Radine Sims Bishop's work on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote about windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors. Mm-hmm. And it feels like what you're doing is giving kids that sliding glass door experience, the transformative piece that if they see themselves, then there's sort of that door they can go through for the next steps, which is powerful.
Yeah, I love her work. I reference it a lot I still work a very, very part-time day job where I do teacher PD, and I reference that video as a lot. And the stats in children's publishing are tricky. Like there's not a lot of representation for diverse races and ethnicities and cultures. There are certainly not a lot of representation of disabled experiences and I also think there's not a lot of representation of class differences in publishing. I think that remains true.
I think so too. And, we haven't even touched on the LGBTQIA stuff as well. Just even questioning where you fit on that spectrum certainly is more challenging perhaps now than it was a couple of years ago as well. And you write about big issues and honest issues for kids. How does that land in this current environment?
It can be a really fine balance to walk. So I am a visibly queer person. It's not something that I can put away. And there's a really nuanced conversation to be had about queer authors who aren't visibly queer and how that can feel to them as well. And they might feel excluded from these conversations when they're not visibly queer. But there's also, I think it's important to acknowledge there can be a privilege to that, as well as complex feelings for those people. But if you're visibly queer and you can't put that away, like I can't just not visibly be a person who has a wife. Like that's this part of my life that is very visible and makes my books easier to challenge and ban because of my identity, not because necessarily I have the most explicit rep that's out there. I don't. I have some queer books. I have some books that are not quite as visibly queer. The romantic suspense that I just published is a romance between a man and a woman. It's very bi. Like it's not a straight book, but it's much more subtle. But I am not subtle. I cannot be, and I think that's the case for many writers who are writing, who are public figures in some sense, and their own identities are on display. And so books by people who are visibly multiple, I think, marginalized identities, so like Black queer authors, face much higher rates of banning than I have. But it is complicated to know how to write a character and know how to write a story that is honest and true and reflects, especially for kids, that reflects their lived experiences without being really easy to ban, easy to challenge, easy to take away from the kids who need it the most. With Little Monsters, there are characters who are definitely queer or gender expansive. And I think especially books where children, not just books where children and teens are experimenting with like maybe who they might have a crush on, so queerness, but transness especially, and exploring gender is at stake right now. And people are not open to those stories, and people are really aggressively banning stories like that. And so Jo is a character who is certainly gender expansive. She is not given a specific label. I wanted to tell a story that felt true to the age she is and to the understanding of herself that she has. And she tries out different costumes. That's kind of in the background information about her. And she often very gender bent costumes. Often she refers to herself as gendery is the word that she has for herself. And I hope that character resonates with children who need it. I hope that some of the ways that I was able to be a little bit less explicit about her character, I hope will protect that book from being banned. I think also writing those characters into something that's a retelling of a classic can offer you a layer of protection. The people who are all about the kids reading the old classic books with no representation are like, oh yeah, well that's fine then. It's Little Women. And so thanks to Louise May Alcott for that. So it's a complicated question, and I have a long answer to it, I know.
But that's a good answer, and it really is complicated. And the roots, at least for Little Women, date back to Louisa May Alcott. I mean, she had a complicated, not well-known story as well. Mm-hmm. And certainly was fighting against what gender norms were for the 1800s.
Absolutely. Some of her short stories that she published under pen names are honestly horror is the word that I would use.
Right.
So her being most well known for this piece of like kind of women's fiction of its time.
Yeah.
I think really honestly upset her. She wanted to be known for those stories where she felt like she defied gender expectations.
Her blood and guts stories.
Yeah, as well as genre expectations. She was like, I can horrify readers just like men can, which I respect.
Well, and those were the books that at least initially brought in the money to, yeah, it was, as you said earlier, it was her different way of doing things than Meg.
Mm-hmm. Yes. She was like, well, I can make us money. I can do this, even if I buck a norm to do so.
So why do you think that, because there are a lot of Little Women variations that are out. It's like we're having a little micro explosion of Little Women variants right now. Why do you think that the time is right for those?
You know, publishing trends are fascinating. I love to examine them. I think that this one is that there's always a bit of nostalgia with this book, but I think that sometimes this community is so small that sometimes I think we see each other doing this like retelling and we're like, oh, I love that book too. Here's maybe what my take would be. Like I know when Gatsby first entered the Great Gatsby first entered the public domain a few years back, every writer I know had some like twist on the Gatsby story. And now we kind of we had a little bit of a market flood of, there was queer Gatsby in space, there was rom-com in New York, and it was so fun. I was like, wow, this kind of came back to life. And I think that sometimes we just like look around us at those other retellings that are happening, and the time just feels right to go and explore your own. So I think there's a little bit of that, like, you know, it's a small community and things spark for each other. And I also think that classic retellings are just having a little bit of a moment. It can be hard to sell brand new stories to people. we see that readers are kind of exhausted with all of the options. And so having a familiar piece to tag people into, to ground people into a story, can also be helpful. So I think it's a combination of those two things. Like this moment is, we all catch a little bit of steam from each other, I think. And also readers are really looking for a grounded, like, this is what this story is, or this is what this story will remind you of. I think that is hard to do right now in a really crowded market. So,
well, and that's where a good pitch like the one you had for Bromantasy really helps.
It does, yeah. If you can do it in one sentence, you can get people to listen up.
All right. So my last question for today is, and it's one I always end the podcast with, what currently brings you hope? We were talking beforehand about living in the Twin Cities and sort of all the stress that has brought with it over the last 6 months. It's no secret we're living in dark times and trying to figure out how we work our way through it. But I find that hope is an action verb. And so the more we can talk about how we're living in hope, I think the stronger we are. So that's my question for you today.
That's a great question to end on. One of my favorite books growing up was The Lumitere Chronicles by Melina Marchetta. And it's about a world that has been ravaged by war. And there is this diaspora of people who are wanting to get back to their homeland. When they do, they find that it is not the same homeland that they left. But there's this character named Beatrice, and what she is known for is that she refuses to stop planting. So no matter how many times their troops come through and uproot everything she has planted for her village, no matter how many times their crops get destroyed, she refuses to stop planting. And I think that that's something that I have carried with me ever since, and that I have seen in the Twin Cities throughout these past months. But for years beyond that, what the Twin Cities were like in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered here was this absolute, like, the community that came together to feed each other, to house each other, to care for each other, was something so much that nobody expected, I think, that nobody could have anticipated. And the way that has created and strengthened since then, in these last few months, I walked into a bookstore that I love that's called Wild Rumpus. It's all kids' books. One Saturday to buy some books in Spanish for kits that were being shared with some families who were sheltering in place at the time. And the bookstore was full of people doing the same. Like, everywhere I walked, they're like, yeah, we have had to get more Spanish and Hmong and Somali books because we are out. We keep selling out because people keep coming in and buying 20, 30 books for kids that aren't theirs so that they have something to read while they're, living at home in this really scary time and not able to leave their homes. And I have seen that from so many people. So, like, how could I not have hope? We keep each other safe. We refuse to stop planting, and we will continue to do so. I think that gives me so much hope.
Well, you give me so much hope too, Mary. Thank you for joining us today. Folks, Bromantasy comes out in May, and you'll be able to get your hands on Little Monsters in August. So put your pre-orders in right now, and once you have read them, I would love to have a chat with you about what you think. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Adventures in Learning podcast with your host, Dr. Diane. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe, download, and let us know what you think, and please tell a friend. If you want the full show notes and the pictures, please go to drdianeadventures.com. We look forward to you joining us on our next adventure.